Hi, this is Larry Bauer, Chief Executive Officer of the Family Medicine Education Consortium. And today I'm surrounded by a team of innovators who've done some very amazing work down at the University of Cincinnati, the Family Medicine Residency Program, training the residents to through the onboarding process so they can learn efficiently how to use the electronic medical record. When I heard about their work, I thought, man, everybody needs to hear about this because it's something that every residency program has to struggle with. So I will quickly go through the introductions here. First, Dr. Eleanor Glass, who is Adjunct Assistant Professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Cincinnati and co-founder of a direct primary care practice that I've had the pleasure to visit a couple of times. Really a remarkable achievement. Dr. Chris Bernheisel, who is the interim chair of the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Cincinnati and has been past director of the residency program. And do you still wear that hat as well, Chris?
No, I do not. Megan Rich is now our program director.
Okay, that's a good thing. Too many hats and you need hat therapy. That's not a good thing. Also, Dr. Louis Flashpoler, who is a rheumatologist. He's the division head of rheumatology at Christ Hospital in Cincinnati. And Dr. Mike Putnam, a family physician who's assistant professor and as member of the core faculty in the Department of Family Medicine. So I understand, Eleanor, that you're going to take the lead. So what I'd like to do is ask if you would kind of give us some background on this work that that you've been doing. How did it start, and what were your goals, etc. You're muted. You're muted, Eleanor.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for having us. Yeah, it's been a journey. As Lou would say, we consider ourselves the TWI underground. We're kind of working on this process as kind of a side method of teaching, and have been for about 7 years now. So when we first started, Lou actually kind of came to us, and kudos to Dr. Flasspoler, who's here as a rheumatologist. He's kind of a family medicine champion and one of our greatest advocates, but he kind of came to us, and I'm going to let him tell a little bit about what got him interested in training within industry. But he, I think, was responding to a lot of the chaos that he was seeing in healthcare, and he really wanted to dive into like why, what are some of the roots of this chaos, and is there anything that we can do to help to respond to it, to help improve our experience in healthcare. And he came across a teaching method that he felt may be helpful, and kind of proposed it to us as family doctors as something that we might be interested in learning more, because I think he really saw in family medicine doctors fertile ground for active learning and process improvement. We as family doctors are kind of never taught to never really accept the standard quo. We're always interested in process improvement and making things better for our patients. And I think Lou was interested in that fertile soil and how we could all kind of grow together. So Lou, can I actually ask you to comment a little bit more about what inspired you to bring TWI to the family medicine department?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it brief for me. So
Lou, I might interrupt and help direct you a little bit if you don't mind at some point.
Not at all. So I was kind of brought up in a family where waste, this idea of stewardship is critical. Both my grandparents went through the Great Depression very hard, and I was kind of in the womb instilled with this idea that we don't waste. And with a grandfather, one of my grandfathers was just incredible about taking what would look like waste and turning it into something useful. And as I got into healthcare, one of my uncles, who's a mechanical engineer, worked in the automotive industry, talked about how in healthcare, in manufacturing, they talk about low-hanging fruit, the waste that's low-hanging fruit. And he said in healthcare, that low-hanging fruit is already canned and labeled. You just need to bend over. And so I've always had this passion for making things better. And late 2008, 2009, 2010, I got this itch I couldn't scratch and started learning about what's called lean, and then learned about these incredible tools that came out of training within, that came out of America, were taken to Japan after World War II and were being repatriated back to the United States, and saw the potential to use those in healthcare, and did a great deal of work within a larger ecosystem, trying to find a home that would not only allow us to work with them with these tools, but also to share the learning. And I knocked on a lot of doors, and finally it was talking to Chris Bernheisel that the door was opened. And I think in retrospect, why that door was opened is that your department, that family medicine department at the University of Cincinnati, is what I would call a servant-led, purpose-driven organization. And I think Chris saw some of those components in what he and I talked about, and saw the ability to use those within the department to leverage a great department. So that's kind of how that door got opened, if that makes sense. And Eleanor, fill in gaps, or Chris, fill in gaps.
No, I think that's great, Lou. We took Lou's wonderful broad vision for process improvement and really found a way to apply it to some of our educational goals. And personally speaking, one of those goals was reducing burnout amongst physicians. I saw so much burnout and so much dissatisfaction with the work, and one of our goals has been to focus things around low-lying fruit. So we have not wanted to apply this approach to things that create a lot of fire, that create a lot of controversy about how they should be done. Everybody felt that they wanted greater efficiency in how they use the electronic medical record. It was just a no-brainer. Doctors want to spend less time in front of the computer and more time in front of their patients. So that's when we really started to see an application for what Lou had here in the residency program. I'll leave it at that, Larry.
Chris, I'm wondering, back when this started, I believe you were the residency director at that point. So what was your take on this? Why did you get interested?
Yeah, so Lou came to me when we talked about training within the industry, and then we were very lucky enough to have someone who actually trained in job instruction. So we took this group of individuals, different faculty, staff, different individuals that got training in something called job instruction. And it was after that first day of training that we had the parking lot moment, the meeting after the meeting. And the meeting after the meeting, Helia Rugg and Eleanor Glass were sitting there and suddenly saw this vision of this can revolutionize how we train so many parts of residency. So much of job instruction is talking about all training, historically training is I tell you what to do, and then you're going to figure it out. As opposed to how do we get you actually to the point where you truly have 100%. And our inclination, even when we receive training, is to just say, I'll get to 50%, I'll figure out the rest. And think about anytime you've ever learned anything, how often you end up saying, oh, you got it, I'm good. And then you actually go do it and you're like, I don't have it. Job instruction is a training process that's been well validated, great evidence on it, on how to actually train people successfully to lead to outcomes that you want to see. And so it was during this parking lot moment where Helia said, gosh, we could do this in so many different things. We could do this in electronic medical record. We could do this in suicide evaluation. But the electronic medical record was the area that we saw as just fruit just sitting there waiting to pick up. And the reason why, because as Eleanor said, it is an area that just causes frustration for all of us. And what we saw in our residents was it would take forever for them to have the EMR get out of the way of their learning, where their first year was just figuring out the EMR often, and you can't focus on learning how to treat heart failure, reduce EF, when you're trying to figure out how do I put in a stinking note, or how do I actually order something. So we thought this would be a great place to start with how can we apply job instruction to the EMR setting. And what Eleanor said, which I really want to stress a lot, is we try to really look at it as this is not so that we can see 20 patients instead of 15. or whatever that number is. It was so that we can have better, more complete, deeper dive experiences with our patients. So the EMR is like driving a car, or EHR, whatever term you use, is like driving a car as opposed to this thing that's obstructing us. We didn't want to stress, now we can see more patients. No, we want to have deeper dives, better relationships with their patients. That's what's going to feed our souls. And so that all spoke to us.
So Eleanor, could you describe the training itself?
Yeah, and that's, I'm going to dive into that, and I'm probably going to let Mike Putnam comment on that because he's become one of our experts on, you know, getting our actual training rubrics out. So, I actually have one visual, Larry, that I can throw up here for your audience if I could do that.
Sure.
Are you guys seeing my screen?
Yes.
So just to review, we saw, okay, we're in healthcare and it feels like there's chaos, there's burnout, there's poor outcomes, there's high expense. What is the time in history that we can learn from? And what was the response to that? So the time that we learned from was basically back in the early days of manufacturing in World War II, where, you know, most of the able-bodied employees of the world had been shipped off to war, and they had to train a new recruit of people to run the factories very quickly. And they developed this training system called Training Within Industry, and a specific tool of that called job instruction. And they used that to train people up to the maximum quality, the best efficient, or the best quality as efficiently as possible. You can't have somebody making poor quality light bulbs that are going to be lighting a tent overseas that are important for planning processes. It has to be 100% quality. And how similar is that to healthcare? You know, we have these new interns coming in, and we can't just have them, you know, kind of putting in orders for maybe the right medicine. It has to be the right medicine at the right time for the right patient. And so we saw an opportunity to learn from the chaos back then and apply it to some of the chaos we saw in healthcare. And again, we felt that the EMR was the prime place where there was interference with our mission as family doctors. We wanted to be excellent physicians for our patients and excellent educators. And we felt that if we can help them master the EMR, then they can get back to the mission of patient care more quickly, rather than continually learning the lessons of the electronic medical record. So I just kind of wanted to review that structure, Larry, before I turn it over to Mike, if you'd be okay talking a little bit about the actual system that we used. And Mike, I'm gonna, while you're talking, put up a screen that kind of shows our actual, some of our techniques, but I'll kind of follow your lead as I do that.
Very good. And so what we identified was, and forgive me for the beeps here, what we identified was, what are the processes that a resident needs to learn to be able to get through patient care? And we envisioned, initially, we took all key stakeholders, our vaccine guru that works in the clinic, those who are very savvy with the smart sets and the prefabricated notes. And we kind of taught that all to the residents and realized while it was good, it was perhaps disorganized. And so then with each one of those teaching sessions, what it was is, just as Dr. Glass had mentioned, it's training next to an experienced person in this job. And as Dr. Bernhazel mentioned, we don't do it once, you don't do it twice, you do it 3 times. You skill build, and then you pause, and on a follow-up session later in internal orientation, you go back to that skill and add to it. So the whole goal is to build this scaffolding of skills that residents are able then to visit and revisit. And what you're doing is, we have this phrase called that unconscious competence. You don't want to have to think about, where was that med, where is that click, because you can get lost in the sea of clicks. Really, it's just, you almost want to build that muscle memory, and so people are proficient so they can actually think about the patient in front of them who's telling them their story. It's all about listening to the patient who's better. And then if I may share a screen as well, oh, and then here is a job breakdown sheet. And so what this was is we broke this down to the most key element to aspects of things you need to do to get from A to Z. And anything that was ancillary, it was in this need to know thing that can be added on later at the end. But really, we boiled it down to these sheets that were referenceable and independent of the instructor. And so if we found a better way of doing it, this sheet would get updated and disseminated and put in the central repository. So every year, if we find a better way of doing a process, it is the defined way of doing that process. So that built our what we taught, and then we had to ask ourselves, what about the structure?
And wait,
we
sorry,
really-
Mike, can I,
oh, go ahead.
can I pause there, Mike? Because I
Yeah.
also wanted to put up this screen because I think there's one important thing that happened that we even started to take for granted was that as we built up these standard processes for doing something, like the example that I have up in front of you is how to bill for a visit. Instead of having to reteach the best process, we were actually able to change the standard setup of our electronic medical record to make people more efficient from the get-go. So I don't know if you want to explain this screen.
Oh,
Mike.
very good. This is super helpful. So there are any time that there is a lack of a need for variability, if everybody has to bill a visit the same way, or if they have a preceptor, they all need that same modifier. What we did is we worked with our IT department and ourselves. We actually did a standard setup so that instead of having to have the variability of knowing how to put in the code for a visit, or what was the code for the preceptor, we built all the speed buttons and then actually arrange them all in the same orientation. So every intern is seeing the same screen. The EMR is great, but there's so much variability built in that it's actually freeing to have less variability. And what was so unique is when we implemented this, the IT department at Christ saw this and they actually implemented what we were doing within our own residency and spread that to standard setup for the rest of the network. So the outpatient view now, what we did for tabs and organization that we developed for ourselves has been disseminated. And so every year, if we develop more standard process, there's hopefully less that you actually need to do as a doctor because it's just built in. So there was that process that Dr. Glassman mentioned.
Oh yes, and so as you can see, Larry, on the original view of what a resident's level of service screen, this is where you bill something. There are 3 tabs at the top for types of visits that you might want to bill for. None of those 3 are types of visits that a family medicine doctor would bill for. I've never used them personally. There is, options to add some additional modifiers, only one of which is one that I actually am familiar with, whereas the screen on the right includes every type of visit that a family medicine doctor might bill for. It includes all of the options for the most common reasons we bring people back for their physical, for a diabetes follow-up, for a mood follow-up, for a routine OB visit. So now rather than having to search for all those options, they become one-click options. We wouldn't have even thought to put those best practices in place without continually going through training this over and over again, watching the experts and saying, oh, hey, you do that so efficiently. Why don't I do something similar? I'm having trouble flipping slides when oh wait, here it is. I'm gonna go back a couple because I think one of the most important kind of visuals of why this works and why we felt that this created growth in our practice is this slide. I don't know if Lou, maybe you want to explain what they're seeing in the slide here.
Actually, you know what? I think Chris is the one that just really jumped out at. Do you mind if I punted to Chris?
Sure.
Yeah, so what Eleanor was talking about and what Mike was talking about was standard setup. And what we know is that a process is either getting better or getting worse. It rarely is staying exactly the same. But in order to make it keep on having cog wheels always getting better, there's a standardization process that has to occur. And so what we did, we said, okay, let's take a look at who is the best at getting a patient discharged. Let's watch them, let's learn from them. All right, now let's set up our standard setup the same way they do it. And then we're going to train them just the way they do it. And that is our standard how we do it. So now we have a new standard. And now the next 6 months, we go back and we look at our residents and say, gosh, you tweaked something. Why did you tweak it? And well, essentially they've done a PDSA and they say, well, we having this here instead of here, it saved me some time. That becomes our new standard and we move up this hill. And now we have a new standard that we're up here. We have new cog. And here's the key is that you can't put that standard in and be done forever and ever. You have to then evaluate every 6 months because every process is always getting worse or better. It rarely stays stagnant. But the standard makes it so there's a cog that will keep it there for a while as you're moving on up. So the standard view and the standard process in there. And then we encourage people, if you're doing it differently, tell us why. And now let's make that new standard. And every intern that comes in will be trained upon this new standard of how we do this process, whether it's discharging or level of service.
And Eleanor, can I jump in here for a second? That so one of the things that really fills my soul on this, Larry, is so in the orientation as we kick this off and as the training starts with this new freshman class of incoming residents, I have a small role in kicking it off. And part of that role is in telling them, look, we know this training isn't perfect. If you run into problems, if you aren't getting something here, let us know. And almost always there's this eye roll that, yeah, you really don't want to hear the problems, and kind of this cynicism of the group. But then what I love, and part of my role, is to stand back and watch as the training is occurring for problems. And as soon as a resident, the first resident identifies some problem, the team swarms that resident. And what we're looking for is, where did we leave the gap? Why didn't this piece work? And then what we are learning from the residents is, we'll say, what would have worked? And what we found is, just because of the gap in, what's the word? I am at best an IT immigrant, where these young residents are native to the IT world, to this new IT world, and they have gifts that we don't even know about and can't even think about, but they can see things that we can't see. And so the training will be improved as the training is occurring. And that first resident that identifies a problem will see the training get upgraded from the problem that they've identified, and they've lifted everybody. And now you see the other residents that say, oh, it wasn't just garbage, what Lou was saying, and they start identifying. And so the training itself is improving the training, which to me is this creating this stone soup and tapping into everyone's gifts and talents. And that's where it really gets fun for me and really fills my soul.
So every residency program in the country, particularly family medicine, has some kind of training that's offered for their incoming residents. Could you describe, either do it one of two ways, either describe how what you're doing now compares to what most others do, or how does what you're doing now compare to where you started when you first began the process? How much time is involved, and what kind of outcomes are you tracking?
Yeah, Larry, it's a good question, because this, I still remember my first EMR training as a first year resident, and the example that they used to show us what is possible in Epic was how to order blood products in the outpatient setting. I have never once, as a family medicine doctor, ordered a blood transfusion for a patient in my office. It's just not something that I would do. And I still remember that standing out to me, because I was being trained by an IT specialist who was wowing me with all the features, all the things that this system could do, but never gave me an example of the 3 things that I wanted to be able to do to survive my first day as a resident. Write a note, order some medicine, tell the patient when to come back. So a traditional electronic medical record training is typically about 4 hours. Again, may not be related to the job at hand for a physician. And the rest of EMR education is never formalized. It's just learned on the job. So every doctor that you work with as a trainee may have a different way of doing things, but you just try to pick up what you can as you go. And one thing we noticed, kind of one of our measures, is that we had third-year residents still asking us to review with them, hey, how do I order that immunization? Or, hey, where again is the order for this type of imaging? Or how do I refer to this doctor? We wanted to get our residents to 100% efficiency, the best that they could do in their first year of residency, rather than this kind of like dabbling along, functioning at about 25% efficacy as they went through their training. So maybe I'll go from there. I'll allow Mike to go back to kind of what he had started on earlier, which is how did we structure our training to be different? And just so you know, we switched to physician-led. So all of our training is physician to physician. And Mike, I'll let you take it from there.
Great, and I'm happy to share. I have a fun little diagram here. So that's a great question to ask there. was, what did we learn for ourselves and how did we change this as we went throughout? And so we realized, just as Dr. Bernhesel said, we found the expert in doing that one thing, whether it was immunizations or discharges, and found that process and boil it down to the best process. But how do we deliver that? And there's two really important key points that we did. One is we found that a lot of trainings were, like Dr. Glass had said, this 4-hour session with an IT department specialist. What we do is we have 2 weeks. We get the residents here during orientation, and we have morning sessions and afternoon sessions. It's not, all day, every day, but every day there's a touch point with at least 4 hours of EMR training where we do a skill, and then we let the residents process it. And then we actually build practice cases where they can go into the play environment and they actually go through and take care of that patient. And the unique thing is this, it's not just going into that one thing, it's actually a patient care visit. And I'm going to share one little diagram here, if I may.
Mike, as you're pulling that up, let me talk about with Larry how that evolved. So Larry, we took that from Toyota, and that's what Mike is talking about, is what Toyota would call the offline line, where if I was training at Toyota to do some component to put the fuel pump on a new car, I may not be up to speed to be on the line to do it. So Toyota will pull a car off of the line, or a few cars off, that allow me to get up to speed. And what we saw early on is that we were training these people in isolation. We weren't giving them real world experience. And so learning from Toyota, we said, how can we create this offline line where we can allow them just to fill prescriptions, or just to write the discharge order, or just to do one component, so that they can get up to speed on that piece before they're put in the real patient experience. And I'll hand it back to you then, Mike.
Can I actually add one more thing beforehand? Because I think some people may gag when they hear, you did 2 weeks? How you possibly have the time for that? Let me tell you, your residents are going to use far more time if you don't invest in the time up front. It's going to happen, it's going to interfere with their education. So this is actually far more efficient, even though it's dedicated, clear time. They're going to use it because they have to learn it somehow. It's just going to be a 3-year process.
And I'll jump in, and I'm sorry, Mike, to pull away from this, but Larry, you asked a question earlier. The very first year I spent a bit of time asking the preceptors after the training, what difference did you see? And it was astounding. The preceptors, as those residents hit seeing their first day of patients, the preceptors were telling me I didn't have to spend any time on the electronic medical record at all, where they were still spending time with their 3rd year and 5th year residents. So what we found is that we had completely freed those preceptors up to teach family medicine care. And then our IT director, 6 months or 8 months into it, ran some background studies that showed that even after 6 or 8 months, the training did not drop off, but they were still, this freshman class of residents was outperforming people 3 to 5 years into the work, if that makes sense. And I'll leave it at that. Mike, hand it back to you.
Yeah, just in a reference to how do we organize it? We want to reduce the anxiety of when the resident gets to clinic on that first day. They've only got one patient an hour as they schedule, but goodness, they can fill that, and you don't want the EMR to get in the way. And so we train them in a way that mirrors clinic. And so if you're seeing here, we train them chart review, how to open a note, how to document within that note, problem list, getting through review of systems, orders, patient instructions, follow-up, and level and service, and out the door. This mirrors exactly what patients can be expected to have to do, or what you expect to have to do with a patient when you're caring for them in the clinic. And so they've done it over and over again when you're practicing with them for these 2 weeks. And so that's really the goal, is to reduce the anxiety. And they've proven it through these practice cases that they can actually do all the skills. And at the end of every day, there's always consensus and skill building, where we're at the shoulder to shoulder, one-on-one teaching. We can catch those flaws. Oh, this is the trick on that. And so you watch them work from A to Z. So really, again, just as Lou said, by the time they get to clinic, they've seen it. And this was the insight we got through our training after 1 or 2 years, that it was needed to be organized in a way that mirrored the clinic workflow so they could see it. And I think that was one of our important areas for growth. One thing for internal metrics that we did for monitoring is we did track resident comfort with the EMR. Dr. Glass mentioned at the beginning, this is all an effort to reduce burnout and focus better on patients. And so we were able to track what was the patient resident comfort with a given skill in the EMR at the beginning, after training, and did it sustain at the end. And we showed that across an intern class with training, these skills maintained. And so that gave us confidence to continue with our training.
I'm curious, have you written this up?
That's a good question, Larry. We have done a couple of presentations on it, but kind of more abstract level content, but not a full article. But I have a document started that is intended to be, that's kind of the next step for us, for sure.
Can I ask, we've got just a few minutes left. If folks are interested in contacting you, is that something that you're open to?
Absolutely. We kind of like to say we like to geek out on this because, you know, as noted, I just kind of threw up on here a slide of some of the lessons that we feel we learned. What was most important here is the learning process and the culture of process improvement. We can't give somebody our slide of how to teach or what to teach in the electronic medical record. It's not about the actual content. It's about having this culture of process improvement so that our residents are always looking for areas to improve. We learned a lot of lessons along the way that we're eager to share. So we used to try this just in the live environment, but we have to have a great practice environment with practice cases in order to teach well. We use a lot of scribing. So that's where a resident is assigned to an attending physician, and it is the resident's job just to use the computer, just to write the note and put the orders in. They're not there to learn medicine. They don't have the angst of seeing the patient. They're there just to master their EMR skill. We have all of our residents do a couple of sessions of that within their first few weeks of residency. And you know, we had a lot of lessons to do. I'll just summarize in how much to teach. You know, you can't overwhelm the learner, and being judicious about what we consider need to know to get through those first few weeks of residency versus need to know, which are kind of additional skills that may not be critical at the outset. And just so you know, we did look at some data early on, which once we were able to figure out how to get Epic to assess efficiency for us, we found out that our top Epic efficiency users in the residency were all interns, people who had just been through the training. So the interns who had just learned with this new method actually were more efficient than our attending physicians who had been doing it for 15, 20 years. So that was kind of an exciting fact for us.
You know, just a thought, but Epic should be paying your team to put on training for family physicians across the country. I'm serious about that.
Well, you know, Larry, the one thing Eleanor said was that we can't hand these over. We would. I mean, we would gladly share our training. Chris often says, if you've seen one Epic, you've seen one Epic system. Right. And so we love sharing, and we love creating teams where we can cross-pollinate, but the Epic systems tend to be different enough that the way they are brought out of the package at one hospital system different. But
so I'm not thinking, Lou, I'm not thinking of the, you know, the details. I'm talking about the process that you've used. I've watched over the years as electronic medical records started to proliferate, and I watched how engineers talked to doctors and basically told the doctors how to think instead of the other way around, and they created very inefficient systems. A lot of money being made, but inefficient systems. You guys have figured out how to create a process improvement team within your organization, and you've developed and you've applied that to this very important area. I'm sure you've applied it to other areas that we're not going to talk about today, but that's the kind of thing that Epic should be saying, okay, this is an innovation that needs to help others to use our product, learn how to use our product. That was the point I was making.
Yeah, and Larry, the one thing I would say, kind of maybe bringing us full circle, as I talked about kind of my journey and saying that I think it was critical what opened the door in the family medicine department was that they are a servant-led, purpose-driven organization. What I've seen in this is that my hypothesis has deepened that it's really not about process improvement, it's about people improvement. And it's about the teams, it's finding, so of the 4 people here, we all have different gifts. As we started this, Larry, I think both Chris and I said to you, Eleanor's gift is as a presenter. We want her to be the point person on this particular process, right, in this team. And when this is done well, you're taking the gifts of every individual and you're on a never-ending basis creating richer and richer stone soup that's lifting the entire community.
So I'm going to just ask any final comments at this point. Eleanor, I'll go to you first.
Thanks, Larry. No, just that it's been a pleasure, because in some ways, you know, one of my favorite lessons that Lou reminds me of is to try to make one small improvement every single day. And that's revolutionized my feelings about the EMR, because sometimes I still feel overwhelmed by it. It's never easy. But if I can do one small thing, maybe make one smart phrase, or maybe change one standing order to make my life more efficient, then those little clicks, you know, they save time for me and save time with my family. And again, this movement, what we've tried to do, and I'm just kind of reiterating, is to move from a features-based EMR training, like, hey, look at all the things your EMR can do, to a workflow-based training. This is the way you should do it. This is the most efficient way to do it, has really been the target of this training, and I think is the biggest lesson for your audience moving forward, or could be. Yeah.
Any other comments? So
I would just again say, to me, that the joy in all this is bringing the gifts of everyone together and using the processes as the fertile soil for growth. And when you can do that and get the alignment, watch out.
Lou, you're making your grandfather very happy.
The only thing I would add is just the need to have a good team and have buy-in. This would be so hard to take it alone, just because there's so many touch points. You know, who are we trying to help? We don't do this for ourselves. This is for each year, the intern class. You're trying to build proficiency up for the residency. So if you teach them well the first time, they then can turn back and train. If you train them well, they will train as seniors when they're on night alone with the intern who comes on. And so if it takes a good core group to train so well when you have a captive audience, we have found it works during the intern orientation time, and then touch points throughout to make sure that we're not slipping backward. So it takes buy-in from people who have contact with the residents at all different parts of the residency.
Chris, any final comments?
I think I would just comment that part of the training is the role modeling that occurs in the training, as Lou highlighted, but I think humility, and then also a component, which is if the learner hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught, which is we never view a situation where we train them and then they do it and they don't do it how we taught them. Our response isn't, oh, you did it wrong. Our response is, I didn't teach this right. How do I need to work on my training some more? And that role modeling then helps them see this humility of we're all learners. We're all trying to make things better.
Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing your experience. I'm just deeply impressed by the team that you've created, by the process that you've created, and the outcomes are fantastic. So thank you very much, and we will be talking soon.
Thank you so much
Thanks so much for having us, Larry.